Hello, and welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Weinberg. This time, we will continue our reading of Early Days by Miss Reed. Holiday Rituals. There were certain rituals, rather like the penny for the one who sees the sea first, connected with Walton. One thing which we always did was to get up very early and accompany Father for a bracing pre-breakfast walk along the esplanade. On our way back, we visited the baker's, where we purchased enough hot rolls for the household's breakfast. There was a wonderful smell of fresh bread, which added to the ravenous appetite already engendered by the early morning ozone. Then there was the trip to Stone Point. This was undertaken in a rowing boat, nobly propelled by our father, while Mother sat with the steering ropes over her shoulders and confused left with right. We trailed our hands and our scorned wooden spades, helping the progress of the boat. A picnic basket lay in the bottom, and there was always a melon for dessert. It would have been unthinkable to go to Stone Point without a melon on board. Stone Point itself was a somewhat bleak stretch of fine sand loosely bound with marram grass. But the beach where we landed was of soft, squelchy sand in which one sank up to one's knees when jumping from the boat. It was most frightening when we were really small, but as the years passed, we became quite blasé about it, and enjoyed tearing along this sea edge, holding Father's hand and roaring with laughter at the sucking sounds, the tumbles, and the general exhilaration of all this exercise. We had to keep a sharp eye open for the tide. It ebbed very quickly from this particular creek, and one terrifying occasion the rowing boat was caught in the mud, and we began to fear that we should never return to the haven of Grandma's house. The mud smelt appalling, and there were gray and black clouds piling up at sea. I rather think some more holiday makers came to our rescue and helped to rock and tug at our boat until we were freed. It was wonderful to get back to New Pier Street after such an adventure, and this time we wiped our shoes thankfully on the door scraper. Of course, there were other ways of going to Stone Point or other places of interest on the Essex coast. One was by a public boat, much larger, called the Minoru. These excursions were announced by the Walton town crier, who added considerably to the pleasure of our holidays. We would hear his handbell ringing while we were eating the hot rolls at breakfast. We all paused, cups suspended in midair, rolls halfway to mouths, to listen to his booming voice. Oyez, 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 this to give notice, the Minoru will make a trip down the river, leaving the old watermill at 10:30, fares 1 and 6. Then he would announce other items of interest, more excursions, articles lost and found, and generally get the attention of all his listeners. I wonder if there is still a town crier in that delectable little town. Long-lost relatives. One day, when we were sitting in the beach hut, my father went for a stroll along the promenade and met a man and his wife who spoke to him. They were accompanied by 2 small boys, one about 6, the other just a toddler. The man introduced himself as Albert Schaeff and said that he believed that the families were related. It seemed miraculous to us as children that we should have stumbled across these relations. In fact, it was not really so surprising. My grandfather and his brother Edward, my great-uncle Ted, had been taken to Walton on the Naze as children, so it was natural that the place was known to his family, although Uncle Ted actually preferred to take his own children to such places as Herne Bay and Margate. He may not have wished, of course, to bump into Brother Tom, who went there frequently and later, of course, lived there. My father and this newfound relative, Albert Schaeff, the son of Edward Schaeff, were first cousins and had plenty to talk about. We soon made friends with the little boys, and the upshot was that they were all invited to visit us at Chelsfield. They so liked the area of Kent that later they bought a house quite near us, and we enjoyed their company for many years. Uncle Albert had a magnificent voice, and he and my father enjoyed singing together. This discovery of another branch of the family was of particular satisfaction to my father, who was glad to feel that the breach between his father Tom and brother Ted had been partially mended in the next generation. Later, I believe, Grandma and Grandpa met this young family at Walton, but I very much doubt if Tom and Ted ever met again. The last years. In the early 30s, Grandma Schafe, who was then just in her 70s, fell ill and went to be nursed by her only daughter, Eva, who lived at Palmer's Green. Eva had one child, a schoolboy called Reg, to whom Grandma was devoted, and it was a very happy household. Grandpa Schafe stayed on at Walton. No doubt it seemed prudent to keep the house going in the hope that Grandma's health would improve and she would be able to return. Unfortunately, it was not to be. She died in 1933 at the age of 73. Grandpa lived for another 2 years, tended to the last by Eva, the only child of his 4 whom he truly loved. I look back upon my 2 grandmothers with deep affection and admiration. Neither had enjoyed an easy life, and when I first became conscious of them, they had just survived one of the most appalling wars known to mankind. Nevertheless, they were always patient, kindly, and laughter-loving. And it is perhaps this last quality of facing life with humor and zest which gave both my grandmothers the aura of warm happiness which they shared so bountifully with their grandchildren. Time remembered. To my school fellows of 1921 through 1924. And time remembered is grief forgotten, and frosts are slain and flowers begotten. From Atalanta in Caledon by A.C. Swinburne, 1837 to 1909. This is an unashamedly nostalgic account of one of the happiest periods of my life. It dwells on that happiness, which is why Swinburne's quotation is used here. It was a time which shaped the pattern of my future. It brought home to me the need to live in the country, to relish the changing seasons, village diversities, and to revere those writers whose particular genius was their interpretation of English country things. Thomas Hardy, W.H. Hudson, Flora Thompson, Edward Thomas, John Betjeman, and a score more. The impact which those 3 years at a Kentish village school made upon me was unusually strong, one might almost say violent, for 2 reasons. First, I was at that stage of life, not quite 8 years old, when one is sharply aware of one's surroundings. It is at this stage in a child's development that imagination is at its most intense, and when witches, ghosts, and giants take the place of Peter Rabbit in one's reading, and when woods and secret places take on a new and thrilling intimacy. I was more than ready. The second reason was that I had suddenly exchanged the pressure of London life for the slower ways of the country, and it suited me. I had always loathed crowds to the point of panic, and to go shopping with my mother, pressed against counters by towering adults, was sheer misery. Knowing only one school from the age of 4, I assumed that all schools were large, noisy, and regimented, with classes of 50 or more to a room. Moreover, I imagined that pressure to strive, to push on to even more arduous efforts, was common to all schools. As an unambitious child, I disliked this wearisome regime. I had no desire to do better than my neighbors, and lacked any envy of their abilities, looks, or possessions. I soon realized that what I really wanted was time to ruminate, time to observe, and often time to be alone. At Chelsfield, I came into my own and have never ceased to be thankful. Brave New World. On the 2nd day of March, 1921, I went with my mother to Hither Green Station in South London to go to our new home. We were bound for Chelsfield, only a few stations down the line, and I looked forward eagerly to the journey. It was a weekday, and I really should have been in school, which made the whole adventure more exciting. I was 7 years old. In those days of the London South Eastern and Chatham Railway, the trains were steam ones, and there was something awe-inspiring about the snorting, throbbing engines which made the whole station shudder when they drew into the platform. Smoke puffed from the chimney and steam gushed from various points along the side of the monster. Doors clanged, porters yelled, whistles blew, flags waved. The din was tremendous. The greasy step up into the third-class carriage was almost too high for a child to mount, but we were soon ensconced on the mottled red and black seats, and able to lean back and admire the photographs of distant resorts arranged just under the luggage rack. Should I ever see the Leys at Folkestone, and those svelte ladies walking there with their long skirts sweeping the grass, and their elaborate hats needing a gloved hand clamped on them to withstand the sea breeze? Would I ever be lucky enough to see the Toadstone in Tunbridge Wells or the Esplanade at Margate? As we chuffed slowly out of the station, I could see my old school, a 3-story building of brick with stone ornamentation, identical to many others put up by the London County Council. I had started on the ground floor there, one of many mixed infants, but fortunate in that my Aunt Rose was one of the teachers and had taken me to school in the early days. Later, I was elevated to the second floor girls, where I shared a classroom with 50 other 6- and 7-year-olds and had real work to do. The boxes of beads, the wet clay balls, the sand trays, and the singing games were left behind. Now the day began in the classroom after morning assembly in the hall with ferocious attacks on multiplication tables. Our teacher was called Miss Sanders, and that was how you addressed her. She seemed to be quite as old as my dear Grandma Reed, but I doubt if she was more than 30. The blackboard was covered in columns of multiplication tables, and we began by chanting in unison, 4 1s are 4, 4 2s are 8, 4 3s are 12, 4 4s are 16, and so on until we reached the crescendo of 4 10s are 40. Then the diminuendo, 4 11s are 44, 4 12s are 48. Then we sank back, but not for long. Within seconds, Miss Sanders' red-tipped pointer would be scampering about the column while we blundered after it, faint but pursuing. 4 7s, 4 7s, 4 7s, our teacher would yell. 28, we shouted back. 7 4s, we would continue our mentor fortissimo. The response would be less robust. Could 7 4s be the same as 4 7s? It seemed that it could. We labored on. Later generations would work it all out with milk bottles or Cuisenaire rods, but I doubt if any of them could match us for a completely instantaneous reaction to such challenges as 9 8s in years to come. We did an awful lot of chanting in those days and rather liked it. Spellings, the days of the week, months of the year, counting to 100 in ones, then in twos, and sometimes in tens. We chanted a money table which began 4 farthings, 1 penny, and ended with a triumphant shout, 21 shillings, 1 guinea. And we learnt a new poem every week. Although why 7-year-olds should be given that heartbreaking poem of Keats beginning, I had a dove and the sweet dove died, I now wonder. It haunts me still. At playtime, in the bare asphalt wastes, there were literally hundreds of us milling about. We mixed infants shared the space with the big girls and watched in admiration as they skipped together, chanting, "Our white ginger beer goes off pop," or salt, mustard, vinegar, pepper, followed by counting, sometimes up to the 40s and 50s, unless some duffer tripped up amidst the groans of her fellows and stopped the twirling rope. There were tops, too, chalked with patterns, and whipped energetically along the asphalt with a string or leather thong on the end of a stick. Top spinners were always in a frenzy and could be quite ferocious if one tripped over their treasure and wrecked its progress. The noise, naturally, was horrendous, and it was almost a relief to hear the whistle blow and scurry into lines ready for marching indoors again. "You will be going to Chesfield School," I had been told by my parents. I assumed it would be much the same, large, noisy, busy with children, and ruled by some dozen or so teachers, exhorting one to sit up, to stand up straight, to stop sucking one's pencil, to work harder, to be neat, to be polite, and to be obedient. That, I took it, was what all schools were like. I felt I could face it after 3 years of the experience. We chugged along steadily through Grove Park, leafy Chislehurst, and Orpington. Here a vociferous porter just outside our window yelled, "Orpington! Orpington! This trade for Chelsfield, Knockholt, Dunton Green, and Sevenoaks. Change at Dunton Green for Chevening Halt, Blasted, and Westerham." "Chelsfield next stop," said my mother. I was glad to hear it. It had been a long haul, I thought, between Chislehurst and Orpington, through flat fields with not much to see. It was years later that Pett's Wood came to be built on that marshy ground, and then houses covered the fields I saw on my first journey, not only there, but further down the line as well. So far, all the stations had been fairly busy, despite the fact that it was late morning and the heaviest traffic had gone. I expected stations to be busy. Until then, my railway trips had been largely up the line from Hither Green to Charing Cross, usually in the company of my maiden aunts Rose and Jess, en route to the theatre or to do some shopping. They, with my bachelor Uncle Harry, lived at 267 Hither Green Lane with my much-beloved Grandma Reed. I was going to miss them all. Even more, I was already missing the companionship of my sister Lil, then age 10, and staying for the rest of that spring term at Hither Green Lane in order to sit a scholarship examination which would determine her future. I should see her at the weekends and when she broke up. In the summer term, no doubt, she would accompany me to the village school before moving to higher things in September. My father had stayed behind to supervise the packing, but was to catch a later train, which accounted for this rare experience of having my mother to myself. The high embankment changed to a lower level until we began to run between chalk cuttings. We were nearly there now, and my mother prepared to descend from the train. It drew up with a squealing of brakes and a hissing of steam. We climbed down carrying our one piece of luggage, a basket with a picnic lunch in it, and I stood dumbfounded. There was no one on the platform except the guard of the train. I had never seen a station like this. There were no posters, no trolleys, no litter bins, no milk churns. Furthermore, once the train had pulled away, everything was still and quiet. Before me, on a green bank sheltered from the wind, primroses were growing, and somewhere high above, birds were singing, which I learnt soon after were skylarks, indigenous to this chalky North Downs country. We crossed by a footbridge, our footsteps echoing hollowly to the up platform. Here things were much more station-like to my eyes. There was a shirt-sleeved porter, metal posters advertising Waverley pens and Nestle milk. There was even a chocolate machine where a penny would buy a bar of the delicious stuff. The porter took our tickets and pointed out the way to our destination. It led across the station yard, through a gate, and on to a footpath beside a wood. The train by now was well inside the tunnel beneath the North Downs on its way to Knockholt Station. The peace of a spring morning enveloped us as we climbed the gentle slope, the wood to our right and the deep railway cutting on our left. We were both glad to stop now and again to have a rest. My mother had been ill, which was the main reason for our move, and I, too, had not long recovered from a bout of the Spanish influenza, which had plagued Europe at the end of the First World War. The wood gave way to fields of springy turf, which made a pleasant resting place. There was a sturdy black metal sign set just inside the wires separating the railway property from our path. It said, "Trespassers will be fined £2." It seemed a pity, as already a few early blue violets could be seen there. However, there was enough to enchant us on this side of the fence. Tiny plants, which I should recognize later as sheepspit scabious and thyme, were being pressed under my legs. The larks were in a joyous frenzy above. The sky was blue, the now distant wood misty with early buds, and the air was heady to a London child. A surge of great happiness engulfed me. This is where I was going to live. I should learn all about birds and trees and flowers. This is where I belonged. Any qualms about a new school vanished in these surroundings. This was the country, and I was at home there. It was a knowledge that was to stay throughout my life. And we will learn more about her early days and her new school next time.